Stop the Nazi Games indeed. Hallo allemaal, daar zijn we er weer. RHTV Live. En natuurlijk streamen live vanuit het mooie Maastricht. In het zuiden des lands. So we are streaming live from Maastricht, which is in the south of the Netherlands. And of course we're going to look at politics and geopolitics. And the first thing we're going to look at is what has been said in The Hague, our political capital. We're going to look at Gideon Vermeijeren from the FVD, who talks about radicalizing and stuff like that. So we're going to take a look at Gideon Vermeijeren. The government wants to, do something about radicalization and stuff like that. And Gideon says there aren't any radicals here in the Netherlands. And if there are, then they want social change and stuff like that. So we're going to look and translate at what Gideon Vermeijeren had said.
In de woorden van de regering zou moeten bijdragen aan de persoonsgerichte aanpak van radicalisering. En dat roept de vraag op wat precies moet worden verstaan onder radicalisering. De dikke Van Dalen omschrijft radicalisering als het radicaal of meer radicaal worden. En een radicaal wordt dan weer gedefinieerd als een aanhanger van een politieke partij of beweging die zeer ingrijpende hervormingen beoogt. En volgens deze definitie mag ik mezelf met recht een radicaal noemen. En daar is volgens mij ook helemaal niets mis mee. Sterker nog, wie ten aanzien van een corrupt systeem dat leidt tot ongekend onrecht zeer ingrijpend.
So basically he put the dikke Van Dalen, which is a language book, right? Gives the definitions of languages and stuff. And according to the dikke Van Dalen, radicalizing is having a good social change, and he can define himself as a radical.
De hervormingen nastreeft, die mag daar heel erg trots op zijn, en dat ben ik ook. De geschiedenis staat bovendien bol van de voorbeelden van radicalen die diepgaande fundamentele systeemveranderingen hebben bewerkstelligd, die tegenwoordig door de meeste mensen juist als positief of noodzakelijk worden gezien.
So he's basically stating in history there were also radicals that wanted a social change. And then, back then, it was seen as radical, but now it's seen as normal, such as the women's vote, right?
Zonder radicalen zou de slavernij nooit zijn afgeschaft. Zonder radicalen zou de scheiding van kerk en staat nooit tot stand zijn gebracht. Zonder radicalen zouden vrouwen nooit stemrecht hebben gekregen. En ook de radicalen uit deze voorbeelden, die vormden in hun tijd een groot...
So he's basically saying, without radicals, the slavery would still exist, right? The people who wanted to fight slavery, they were seen as radicals. Because that was the consensus, that was normal back then.
Grote bedreiging voor de gevestigde orde. Op het moment zelf kregen ze te maken met extreme weerstand en kritiek uit de hele maatschappij. Hun ideeën stonden immers haaks op wat mensen in hun tijd normaal vonden. Ze werden beschimpt, bespot, vervolgd in politieke processen en opgesloten. Dat is het lot van de radicaal. Maar dankzij volharding, doorzettingsvermogen en radicale acties van hongerstakingen en burgerlijke ongehoorzaamheid tot verstoringen van publieke evenementen hebben zij...
So basically he's talking about the radical, right? The one with radical ideas. They're arrested, politically prosecuted and stuff like that. So yeah, and he defines himself as a radical. So
significante systeemveranderingen kunnen afdwingen die tegenwoordig worden omarmd en zijn geïntegreerd in de gehele maatschappij. Het is goed te verklaren dat de gevestigde orde radicalisering wil aanpakken. De zittende macht beschermt daarmee immers haar eigen machtspositie, maar dient...
So he's telling that it's normal that, governments want to get this radicalization because they want to stay in power.
Daarmee zeker niet automatisch ook het algemeen belang. En dat brengt me bij mijn inhoudelijke kritiek op het wetsvoorstel. Want het is aan degenen die hier zitten om het algemeen belang te dienen, en daar reken ik mezelf graag toe, om daar uitermate kritisch naar te kijken. Het voorstel creëert een wettelijke grondslag voor ongekozen burgemeesters om samen met politie, het Openbaar Ministerie, de reclassering en eventuele andere partijen te overleggen over personen die zouden radicaliseren, vrijheidsbeperkende maatregelen op elkaar af te stemmen en daarvoor persoonsgegevens met elkaar uit te wisselen.
So he's saying the mayor and the police and stuff like that, they're profiling people right now, and basically saying that is radical, that is not, basically spying on the population.
Wat daarbij opvalt is dat de definitie van radicalisering die in het wetsvoorstel wordt gehanteerd sterk afwijkt van de woordenboekdefinitie die ik in mijn inleiding heb genoemd. In het wetsvoorstel wordt radicalisering gedefinieerd als het proces dat uiteindelijk kan leiden tot terroristische activiteiten of tot extremistische activiteiten.
So they're talking about, putting in a new law against radicalization. And their definition is, he or she may be radicalized and this and that. And, it's insanity. Totalitarian government trying to take over the society, basically, because they are scared. The truth is not allowed to come out.
En vanzelfsprekend moeten personen die daadwerkelijk terroristische of extremistische activiteiten willen gaan verrichten, waaronder ik in het bijzonder versta dat zij geweld zouden willen gebruiken, die moeten worden aangepakt, uiteraard. Maar deze definitie gaat een heel stuk verder. Volgens de definitie in het wetsvoorstel ben je namelijk al aan het radicaliseren wanneer sprake is van dat zogenaamde proces dat uiteindelijk kan leiden tot terroristische of extremistische activiteiten. En er wordt geen enkel handvat gegeven over wanneer sprake zou zijn van zo'n proces. Stel nu dat de inwoner van een gemeente zich zorgen maakt over de komst van een windturbinepark. Eerst spreekt hij zich op social media uit tegen de komst van dat windturbinepark.
So he's basically saying, what if there's the civilian that, there's a wind turbine park and he's against that park? He's giving an example.
Vervolgens start hij een petitie tegen de komst van dat windturbinepark en weer even later organiseert hij een demonstratie tegen zo'n windturbinepark. Dan zou er zomaar ergens in Nederland een ongekozen burgemeester kunnen zijn die meent dat sprake is van een proces dat uiteindelijk kan leiden tot extremistische activiteiten. Het is misschien helemaal niet waarschijnlijk dat hij extremistische activiteiten zou willen verrichten, maar dat hoeft ook niet.
So he's giving an explanation about this, guy, wind turbine park. He's against it. He first speaks out in social media, and then, he gets more people, and government sees this as radicalization, right?
Kan. Er zijn misschien helemaal geen feiten en omstandigheden waaruit blijkt dat hij extremistische activiteiten voorbereidt. Maar dat hoeft ook niet, want het kan. Er is wellicht helemaal geen directe dreiging van extremistische activiteiten, maar dat...
It's a possibility, it's a possibility that this guy is radical, and then government can intervene, basically. Whilst, who knows? The guy may not even be radical and stuff like that. It's really, really totalitarian. A totalitarian concept that we are fighting against. Ja, mensen, we verstaan het wel. Hè? We hebben te maken met een totalitair staat die radicalisering wil aanpakken. Nou, in mijn optiek is het radicaal als een overheid zegt, om 9 uur mag jij niet meer naar buiten toe gaan. Nee, dat mag niet meer. In mijn optiek is het radicaal dat de overheid mensen benadeelt, ook nog kinderen afpakt en noem het allemaal op. Dat is radicaal. Daar is de overheid niet voor bestemd.
Het hoeft ook niet, het kan. En dat is op grond van dit wetsvoorstel voldoende om als radicaal te worden bestempeld. En zo kan deze beste man, die nooit de wet heeft overtreden, voordat hij het weet, onderwerp zijn van een overleg tussen burgemeester, politie, het Openbaar Ministerie, de reclassering en tal van andere partijen, waarin interventies worden besproken en persoonsgegevens worden uitgewisseld. We hebben de afgelopen jaren te vaak gezien,
So you gave that example, right? The guy that's against the wind turbine park, and he says, mayors can have these conversations with police, with even psychiatrists and stuff like that, because they deem him as radical, right? And maybe there's a whole profile about me, because they deem me as radical. I want a better government. That's what I want. Ik wil niet dat een regering mensen gaat benadelen. Ik wil niet dat een regering oorlogen gaat voeren en ook nog zoveel jaar steun geeft, terwijl het buitenparlementair besloten is. Our government is funding Ukraine for 10 years and Parliament had no say in this. That is what I don't want, right? I want a government that functions. And call me radical, but that is supposed to happen. You have to have a government that functions, not a government that puts people as radicals or right-wing extremists and stuff like that. That is totalitarian. Putting a definition, putting someone in a cage, right? Specifying him as right-wing, radical, and this and that. It's insane. Insane. We are supposed to be free. Government is supposed to work for us, not we for the government.
Veel voorbeelden van overheidsonderdelen, waaronder ook gemeenten en de politie, die onrechtmatig onschuldige burgers aan het bespieden waren, met alle gevolgen van dien. En daarom maak ik me ook ernstige zorgen over onevenredige inbreuken op de privacy en andere grondrechten van onschuldige burgers die geen enkel strafbaar feit plegen en dat ook helemaal niet van plan zijn. Dat is waar dit wetsvoorstel in de huidige vorm alle ruimte voor biedt. Ook de Nederlandse Orde van Advocaten heeft gewaarschuwd voor dit risico en die heeft gepleit voor een nadere definitie van radicalisering. Maar dat advies is door de regering om...
Even lawyers said we need a better definition of radicalizing instead of what you give us, right? Government. We need a better definition. So even lawyers are against this new law to anti-radicalize the population. It's really weird.
Onduidelijke redenen niet overgenomen, maar heel gemakzuchtig weggeschreven in de memorie van toelichting. Daarnaast is totaal niet te overzien hoe ijverig burgemeesters van deze bevoegdheden gebruik gaan maken. Want het maakt nogal een verschil of er sporadisch in enkele gemeenten een overleg plaatsvindt over een persoon waar daadwerkelijk een reëel gevaar van uitgaat, of dat er straks in alle ruim 300 gemeenten aan de lopende band tientallen onschuldige burgers worden besproken die geen enkel kwaad in de zin hebben. Kan de minister een inschatting maken van de aantallen waar we het nu over hebben? Ze geeft aan dat dit soort casusoverleggen nu al plaatsvindt en dat het...
So Gideon is asking for numbers. How many radicals are there in the Netherlands? Give me an estimate.
Het wetsvoorstel dus slechts een codificatie betreft van een bestaande praktijk, maar hoe vaak komt dit nu voor? En wat voor gevallen betreft dit tot nu toe? In hoeveel procent van de gevallen gaat het over vermeend linksextremisme, rechtsextremisme, jihadistisch extremisme, dierenrechtenextremisme of andere vormen van zogenaamd extremisme? En deze vragen hebben betrekking op de stand van zaken.
So he's asking about the forms of extremism, right? Animal extremism, jihadi extremism, this and that, He wants numbers. How many people are extreme? Because, if you want to pass this law, you need numbers, right? You need numbers. De-radicalize the population. Yeah, right. It's because of all these measurements, people get radicalized.
Maar ik ben ook benieuwd en zou de minister willen vragen of zij bereid is om, indien dit wetsvoorstel wordt aangenomen en in werking treedt, periodiek de Kamer te informeren over hoe deze aantallen zich ontwikkelen. En waarom is er niets geregeld over het toezicht op de wijze waarop gebruik gemaakt wordt van deze bevoegdheden?
De overheid is zelf radicaal. Our government is radical by themselves, right? We support one side of the war, whether it's Israel or Ukraine. We support one side of the war. We're not even looking at Sudan. No one in the Netherlands is talking about the war in Sudan. But I am. But we're not really funding that, So it's not in the news. You do hear it at RHTVLive.
De deelnemers van dat casusoverleg zelf, die moeten weliswaar zelf jaarlijks een verslag uitbrengen over de effectiviteit van die overleggen, maar zij zullen vanzelfsprekend niet snel tot het oordeel komen dat zij zelf een foute inschatting hebben gemaakt. Moet hier niet door een externe partij toezicht op worden gehouden?
So he's basically asking for annual reports when this new law is passed, right? And, the government says, well, I don't care. So it's shouting in air, but he is right. I want annual reports. Who is radicalizing in my country, right? And I want to know. And the way I see it, the government is radicalizing. Gideon van Meijeren is also being put in front of a judge because he had said something. And the Justice Department defines it as it could be radical, what you're saying here. He said, you have the right to demonstrate peacefully. Now, our Justice Department deforms what he had said, and they make out of it you can demonstrate even though you're violent. You can also use violence, and this is what the Justice Department says. He said, right?
En wat zijn de mogelijkheden voor burgers die er op enig moment achterkomen dat zij in verband gebracht worden met radicalisering om deze beslissing aan te vechten? Mevrouw Helder die had het erover dat zo'n besluit op grond van de AWB vatbaar is voor bezwaar en beroep, maar daarover wordt met geen woord gerept in het voorstel of in de toelichting. En het is maar zeer de vraag of hier ook sprake is van een besluit in de zin van de AWB. En als de minister beoogt dit soort beslissingen vatbaar te laten zijn voor bezwaar en beroep, dan verdient het ook aanbeveling om dat expliciet op te nemen in het voorstel, voordat dadelijk een rechter tot het oordeel komt dat hier geen sprake is van een besluit in de zin van de AWB.
So, as I've said, right, Gideon Vermeer needs to go to court because he said something that is defined by the courts as extreme. So we're going to take a look at this here. Lawfare is being used in the Netherlands and in other Western countries.
En u bent geboren op 27 mei 1988 in Doetinchem. Klopt dat ook? Meneer Vermeijeren, we zijn hier vandaag bij een regiezitting van de strafzaak, van uw strafzaak. En u hoeft op verdere vragen geen antwoord te geven als u dat niet wil. U moet wel goed opletten. We gaan de zaak, zoals u weet, niet inhoudelijk behandelen vandaag. Het is vandaag een regiezitting. En dat betekent dat eventuele wensen van uw kant omtrent onderzoek, verder onderzoek en omtrent andere dingen, planning van de zitting en dergelijke aan de orde kunnen komen.
So here we have Gideon Vermeer, who basically said you have the right to demonstrate, and the Justice Department makes something else out of that, of what he said, and he has to go to court because of what he said, right? So who's radical here? In my opinion, it's government, because someone in politics can say anything basically. They're immune to what they have to say, basically, right? They have immunity. But no, not Gideon Vermeer, not the FVD, because they're seen as a party who wants radical change, right? So this is all happening in the Netherlands. We just saw Gideon Vermeer give a speech, not all of it, but most of it. So this is happening in the Netherlands. Lawfare is being used on political parties. They even want to ban Forum for Democracy. So, this is all happening. So now you guys know what's happening in the Netherlands, and we'll keep you posted on what's happening. But we're also going to take a look at other stuff, such as Venezuela, right? We know there was a referendum in Venezuela about Guyana, 1/3 of Guyana, basically. And there was an exemplary yes for the annexation of the part in Guyana. And now there are troops at the border, and there, tens of thousands of troops at the border, and they are going to annex Guyana. So it's very very interesting to see what's going to happen here. So we're going to take a look at a video of Venezuela talking about the situation. They can say it better than I can. So we're going to take a look at this here. Why Venezuela is preparing to conquer Guyana.
On the 3rd of December 2023, Venezuela hosted a nationwide referendum on whether or not their country should annex 2/3 of Guyana's territory, their geographic neighbor immediately to the east. This region of Guyana is known as Essequibo, and it's a huge piece of land, only slightly smaller than the U.S. state of Florida is. But Guyanese themselves were not welcome to vote in the Venezuelan referendum calling for the partition of their own country. A couple days later, on the 5th of December, the Venezuelan government claimed that more than 10.5 million people, or more than 1/3 of their entire population, had voted in the referendum, and that 95% of the votes were in favor of annexing the Essequibo region from Guyana, and creating a brand new Venezuelan state out of it to be called Guyana Essequiba. But in reality, third-party international observers believe that fewer than 2.4 million Venezuelans actually participated in the referendum. But that didn't stop Venezuela's decade-long autocratic leader, Nicolas Maduro, from declaring that the Venezuelan people had spoken loud and clear, claiming that the vote was so overwhelming that the Venezuelan government has no other choice than to abide by it. Maduro immediately ordered the publishing of a brand new official map of Venezuela that includes the Essequibo territory to be displayed in every school, university, government building, and house in the country. A Venezuelan general was immediately appointed by Maduro to become Venezuela's new governor of the territory, while Venezuelan troop movements directly near the border with Essequibo began increasing in activity, and satellites revealed increased Venezuelan airstrip and road construction beginning near the border as well. The Venezuelan government promptly issued arrest warrants for political candidates in the country who opposed the referendum and the annexation. Well, immediately before the referendum on the annexation took place, Venezuela's defense minister very publicly and ominously stated that Venezuela's dispute with Guyana over the Essequibo is, quote, not a war for now. Guyana has, of course, denounced Venezuela's referendum and rejected their unilateral demand to annex 2/3 of their territory. If Venezuela wants to truly annex the Essequibo region beyond their own self-published maps, they will have to come and claim it themselves. But an all-out Venezuelan invasion of the Essequibo will not be an easy task. The theater of operations will be huge across an area roughly the size of Florida, and at the northern edge of the Amazon rainforest, it's also almost entirely covered by incredibly dense jungle. It's also very sparsely populated, with only about 128,000 people who actually live there, which makes the Essequibo one of the most sparsely populated places in the entire world, with an average density that's less than half the density of Lapland in far northern Finland above the Arctic Circle. Nonetheless, that hasn't stopped the Venezuelan government from already offering Venezuelan citizenship to all of the 128,000 people who live here, including rolling out identification cards for all of them. But because the region is so densely jungled and so sparsely populated, there's been very little need to ever build out any infrastructure in the region or develop it from Guyana's perspective. As a result, there's literally only one single paved road that runs from Venezuela into the Essequibo region and into Guyana in general. And it runs through Brazil first before it enters into Guyana later. Immediately alarmed following Venezuela's referendum and demand for the Essequibo's annexation then, and worried that in order to enforce their claims, Venezuelan troops and their logistics may use the strategically vital paved road and march through their territory, Brazil has already deployed their own troops and vehicles to the region around the road to try and discourage the Venezuelans from ever attempting it. And at the same time, the United States Air Force has already begun conducting aerial patrols over Guyana's territory to send a further message to the Venezuelans to not try their luck. And just like that, seemingly out of nowhere, there's a major geopolitical crisis in South America, and a genuine risk of state-on-state warfare exploding in Latin America for the first time in decades. A war that could involve not only Venezuela and Guyana, but Brazil and the United States as well. But if the Essequibo region is so underdeveloped, so sparsely populated, and so geographically challenging for Venezuela to invade in the first place, then why is Venezuela threatening a land grab war right now all of a sudden to take it? Well, as usually does in the 21st century, the answer is actually a lot more complicated than it appears at first. It has to do with oil, the global struggle for the control of access to energy resources, historic grievances over the age of colonialism, and literally trillions of dollars worth of bounty to whoever eventually emerges victorious. And the risk of conflict spreads very far from the shores of just Guyana and Venezuela. Throughout the 20th and 21st centuries, it became well understood that one of the single largest concentrations of crude oil that could be found anywhere in the world was right here across Venezuela, in an area known as the Orinoco Oil Belt. For decades, oil companies from around the world attempted to discover additional oil deposits around this area, but with only limited successes. There were hunches that the oil belt in northern Venezuela might have extended further to the east and into the northern reaches of Guyana's maritime exclusive economic zone. But then in 2014, after dozens of attempted drillings in Guyana's offshore with no luck, Royal Dutch Shell decided to throw in the towel and sell out the entirety of their 30% stake in Guyana's offshore oil project to an American independent petroleum company named Hess. Hess bought out all of Shell's shares in the project for $30 million. Acquiring their 30% stake in the project was being spearheaded by ExxonMobil with a 45% stake, and joined by the China National Offshore Oil Corporation with an additional 25% stake. And the very next year, Hess's gamble on buying out Shell's shares would result in one of the biggest jackpots in the entire history of the oil industry. And that's because in 2015, this consortium led by ExxonMobil began discovering a series of historically massive offshore oil deposits about 100 miles north of Guyana's coast. Exxon would later confirm that these offshore oil fields within Guyana's exclusive economic zone represented an estimated total of 11 billion barrels worth of recoverable oil, a find that represents what is, to date, the single largest oil discovery of the 21st century, and a fact that almost overnight catapulted Guyana from having zero known oil reserves to having the 17th largest oil reserves in the world, with an amount of oil wealth that's nearly equivalent to the entirety of neighboring Brazil or Algeria. By 2023, Exxon would calculate that these oil reserves in Guyana were worth an estimated $500 billion. And more might end up being discovered too. And in order to capture it all, the Exxon-led consortium has already invested more than $40 billion into developing offshore oil platforms and projects in Guyana just since 2015. And they're expected to continue investing tens of billions of dollars more by the end of the decade.
Now, you may ask yourself, why is there a French Guyana? Right? Because if we're looking at the map, you see French Guyana. So during the colony ages, right, we as Dutch had Suriname, which was a lot bigger, and that was also part Guyana, part what we know now as French Guyana, right? They changed their name basically into Guyana, and now we're going into history, right? Because the English had a war against Napoleon, right? Now the French had taken over the Netherlands, the Batavian Republic, it was called, which ended up Guyana basically being French. So the English took over, right, and basically partitioned what was then Suriname, and made Guyana and Suriname and French Guyana, basically. So that is some history there. And yeah, we're going to go back to that interesting video.
Exxon-led consortium also signed a deal with Guyana in 2016 that would split the profits of their oil 50-50. 50% to the government of Guyana and 50% to the Exxon-led consortium, in addition to 2% royalties to the Guyana government as well. Offshore oil rigs were rapidly built and put into place, and production began near the end of December in 2019. And then in October of 2023, just a month and a half before Venezuela would hold its referendum, Chevron announced that it would be buying out Hess for a whopping $59 billion. Immediately before this, Hess's 30% ownership stake in the Guyana offshore project that they had bought from Shell for only $30 million just 9 years previously was estimated by Citigroup analysts to be worth about 43% of Hess's total portfolio, meaning the Chevron is largely buying out Hess for their shares in Guyana, and they value those shares at more than $25 billion. more than 830 times what Hess paid for them 9 years ago. Currently, as of the end of 2023, Guyana is producing about 380,000 barrels of oil a day from these offshore fields, which isn't nothing. But within only a few years from now, by 2027 or 2028, as more foreign investment pours in and more platforms are developed, they're expected to increase production levels to about 1.2 million barrels per day, which by then will be just over 1% of the entire planet's production, and rank Guyana roughly alongside modern-day Algeria's production levels. With a total population of only around 8,000 people, Guyana will by then become by far the largest per capita producer of oil in the world, and by 2036, its government will be raking in about $16 billion a year in taxes and levies on the oil industry.
A figure that's nearly 4 times as much as Guyana's entire economy was before the discovery of oil back in 2014.
As a result, Guyana has been experiencing the fastest growing economy anywhere in the world ever since 2021, as the money keeps pouring into the country from the Exxon-led consortium and as the oil fields continue being developed. Across 2022 alone, the Guyanese economy grew by an almost unbelievable 62.3%. Before the discovery of oil in 2014, Guyana was a sleepy little country with very few other major industries, and so the GDP per capita in the country was merely $5,400 per person per year, which made it one of the poorest countries in the Americas. But now, by 2028, with the unexpected oil boom, Guyana's nominal GDP per capita is expected to rise to more than $37,000 per person within just the next few years, which by then will be the third highest in the Americas, only behind the United States and Canada, and about on a par with Italy. It's for this reason that some people have already taken to calling Guyana the world's next United Arab Emirates, another small, formerly British-controlled country that was once extremely poor, but managed to grow exorbitantly wealthy, influential, and powerful in the world within only a matter of years through the harnessing of their oil might after it was discovered. Obviously, Guyana has emerged in the 2020s as the most important new addition to the global energy map in the 21st century, and that has brought it incredible levels of attention from the outside world that it never could have imagined before. Most of Guyana's present and likely future oil exports as well are flowing on the backs of tankers across the Atlantic towards the biggest port in the European Union, Rotterdam in the Netherlands, a fact that's greatly benefiting the Europeans, as they've been able to use Guyana's recently come online oil to help replace some of their previously large volumes of Russian oil that they've cut out over the war that's still raging in Ukraine. OPEC, the international oil cartel that's made up of most of the world's largest producers, has already been approaching Guyana with the prospect of becoming their latest member. Advances that Guyana, for the moment, has publicly rejected in favor of maintaining their own independence. But that independence may not last forever, because directly next door to all of their amazing oil discoveries and incoming wealth ever since 2015, has been Venezuela, who, despite having literally the largest crude oil reserves of any country in the world, has been gradually struggling to actually produce any of it ever since the 1990s. As you can see from this graph, Venezuela's oil production was once around 3.2 million barrels a day back in the mid-1990s, a rate that if they had continued managing today would have placed their production in the top 10 worldwide, right alongside the likes of Persian Gulf states like the United Arab Emirates and Iran. But they didn't maintain that rate, and in fact they've seen a continuous decline in oil production over the past 30 years.
Well, that's because there are sanctions against Venezuela, right? We had Hugo Chavez, who basically said, the devil has entered the building after George Bush left the United Nations. I'm not making this up, right? I'm not making this up. So sanctions were put on Venezuela ever since the Bush era, and hey, you can see that in the chart,
Ever since, to the point where today, they're barely producing more than 700,000 barrels a day, a rate of oil production that's even less than the United Kingdom, despite Venezuela having more than 120 times the amount of proven reserves as the UK does. Now, Venezuela produces and exports so little of their own oil that tiny Guyana right next door to them is all set to surpass both their production and export volumes within just the next 3 years. Despite having a much younger industry where production only began at the end of 2019, and despite having vastly smaller volumes of reserves than Venezuela. And the reason for that is very complicated. In comparison to the much more recent oil industry in Guyana, the oil industry in Venezuela dates back more than a century ago to 1922, when Royal Dutch Shell first hit oil in the country in the Maracaibo Basin here in the far north.
It's always the Dutch, huh? Always the Dutch.
Northwest of the country. That discovery sparked an unprecedented oil boom in the country, and by the end of the decade in 1929, there were more than 100 foreign energy companies operating in Venezuela, all drilling for oil, while the country's production had exploded to become the second highest producer in the entire world, remaining only behind the United States' oil production itself. But at the same time, Venezuela was ruled by an autocratic military dictatorship, and that regime...
Well, during the golden era of Venezuela, you had outside companies, stealing their oil basically, and using it for themselves. This is why Venezuela was very rich back then, even though they had a dictator.
Failed to properly diversify the country's economy away from the ballooning oil industry. By 1935, within only 13 years of when oil was first discovered in the country, oil was already making up more than 90% of all of Venezuela's exports, and the country had become the leading petrostate in the Western Hemisphere. Moreover, only 3 foreign energy companies had managed to outmaneuver and outcompete all of the others to dominate 98% of the entire Venezuelan oil market. In the 1940s, Venezuela passed a new law that required these foreign energy companies to pay half of their oil profits to the state. The companies complied, and Venezuela's government revenue exploded. But with that came a classic problem that every petrostate before and since has had to confront. With government revenues coming more from taxes on oil production and foreign oil companies, the government begins relying less and less on the taxes from their own citizens. And so, the government begins becoming less accountable to its own people, which opens the door to the country's ruling elite to become more corrupt and more authoritarian over time. Which is exactly what ended up happening in Venezuela. Venezuela became one of the founding members of OPEC alongside Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, and Kuwait in 1960. And then they created their own state-owned oil company the same year, the Venezuela Petroleum Corporation. And with that, they felt that they had enough leverage to increase the taxes on foreign oil companies' profits from 50% to 65%, which the companies continued to begrudgingly go along with. And then in the 1970s came the global oil price boom that followed the OPEC oil embargo of countries that supported the Israelis during the Yom Kippur War of 1973. Tens of billions of dollars in oil profits started flooding into the Venezuelan government's coffers, which led government officials to make several short-sighted decisions. In 1976, with the oil boom still roaring, the Venezuelan government decided to nationalize their oil industry and established a new state-owned oil company called PDVSA that would monopolize all of the exploring, drilling, production, refining, and exports in the country. Foreign oil companies were still allowed to continue operating in Venezuela after 1976, but they could only do so under a joint venture with PDVSA, and PDVSA had to own a minimum 60% stake in the joint venture. But as is well known in the oil industry, prices never remain high forever, and for every boom time, there's a bust time that always follows. In the 1980s, the global price of oil crashed, and so too did Venezuela's undiversified government revenues. Inflation in the country accelerated, but the government continued taking on huge amounts of debts by continuing to spend aggressively, most notably with their purchase of half of the American oil and gas company Citgo in 1986, and then the purchase of the remaining half of the company 4 years later in 1990. Venezuela's purchase of Citgo was strategic for multiple reasons, though. Venezuela's oil reserves, while being the largest in the world, are also among the lowest quality in the world. Venezuela's oil is extremely heavy and crude, full of impurities like sulfur and mercury that requires a lot of technical expertise to drill out of the ground. And then it requires a much more intensive refining process to transform into usable finished end products like gasoline. This is in stark contrast to the oil fields of Saudi Arabia, which are slightly smaller than Venezuela's in volume, but are also far lighter and far more pure of contaminants, which makes Saudi oil significantly easier and cheaper both to drill and refine than Venezuelan oil is, which is a huge part of what has made Saudi Arabia the world's most influential oil power, and Venezuela a mere secondary player. Across the 1980s, American oil refineries across the Gulf Coast in Texas and Louisiana began anticipating that the world was starting to run out of the lighter, more pure crude oil deposits that were easy to refine, and as a result, everyone was eventually going to have to start refining the heavier and less pure crude oil going forward, like the oil that's found in Venezuela. Consequently, most of America's Gulf Coast refineries began retooling themselves to handle the world's heavier and less pure oil, and they became some of the only refineries in the world that could actually handle the processing required of Venezuela's extra heavy crude oil, and their geographic proximity to Venezuela's oil fields made them the logical choice for the Venezuelans to use. PDVSA's acquisition of Citgo in the late 1980s, while expensive, enabled Venezuela to acquire direct ownership over some of these vital refineries, while it also gave them control, for a moment, of about 10% of the entire US domestic oil market, which established this really lucrative trade route where PDVSA would produce super heavy crude oil in Venezuela, export it to Citgo refineries on the US Gulf Coast that they owned after 1986, and then sell the refined gasoline they produced in them directly to American consumers, as the US market became the biggest export destination for Venezuelan oil. By 1997, Venezuelan exports of crude oil to the US market peaked, and America was importing about 17.4% of their oil from Venezuela. More oil than the Americans were importing from Saudi Arabia at the time, or from anyone else as well. Venezuela had become America's #1 largest source of oil, but corruption and graft within the Venezuelan government had by this point become endemic. Between 1972 and 1997, as the oil wealth poured into the country, the Cato Institute has estimated that Venezuelan government officials embezzled as much as $100 billion worth of the state's oil revenues, a truly astonishing level of corruption. By 1989, with continued government spending on social welfare programs and foreign acquisitions like Citgo, the country's public debt had climbed up to $29 billion, or about 66% of their total GDP at the time, and $20 billion of that amount was owned to foreign banks. So, in 1989, Venezuela appealed to the International Monetary Fund for a financial bailout, and as a part of those negotiations, they agreed to a series of austerity measures that cut back on social welfare spending, and that sparked a series of deadly riots across the country that killed hundreds. In 1992, with unrest in Venezuela mounting and the government growing increasingly unpopular, a then largely unknown Venezuelan military officer named Hugo Chavez launched a coup d'etat against the government. The coup attempt failed, more than 140 people were killed, and Chavez and his conspirators were arrested. Hugo Chavez would spend the next 2 years in jail for his role in organizing the coup until he was pardoned in 1994. But his actions had catapulted him into Venezuela's national spotlight. And riding on that momentum after he was released from prison, he decided to try and become Venezuela's next leader through more legal means by running for president in 1998. Chavez ran under a socialist campaign that promised to distribute Venezuela's massive oil wealth more equitably to the poor of the country. He promised to end the corruption and the graft that had long been associated with Venezuela's government and oil industry, and it was on this message that the Venezuelan working class voted Chavez into power in 1998. Over the next few years, as the price of oil continued to remain high and Venezuela continued making lots of money, Chavez followed through on his campaign promises and dramatically expanded social welfare and healthcare spending in the country.
Now we have Maduro who's in power. Right? Chavez had died and basically appointed Maduro as next president. And Maduro is president for a very, very long time. And the sanctions against Venezuela are getting tougher and tougher. This is why Venezuela had a referendum about Guyana, right?
Country, and managed to greatly reduce the national poverty rate in the process. This earned him an incredible amount of popularity among Venezuela's working class that then enabled him to continue expanding the powers of his own office in the country with very little pushback. Independent media outlets were steadily shut down, press freedoms grew smaller, and presidential term limits were abolished, while Chavez expanded the control of his own party over the national oil industry. The remaining oil projects in the country that were jointly owned between PDVSA and American energy companies like Exxon and ConocoPhillips were seized entirely for PDVSA, while Chavez nearly simultaneously fired thousands of experienced PDVSA employees who went on strike between 2002 and 2003, who he then replaced with more inexperienced party loyalists. The end result of expelling highly experienced foreign companies and gutting PDVSA of many of their most experienced workers at the same time resulted in a sharp decline of Venezuela's productivity when it came to oil production. But the Chavez administration wasn't finished with its mismanagement of the industry just yet. Venezuela began voluntarily selling their oil at a subsidized discount to fellow nations in the region who they considered to be friendly, such as Cuba and Nicaragua, while Venezuela continued distancing their own foreign policy away from the United States and closer towards Russia and China. Chavez's administration in Venezuela led the country into purchasing $20 billion worth of arms from Russia, equipment that included Russian fighter jets, surface-to-air missile systems, and dozens of tanks. Venezuela was able to pay for all of this equipment by granting the Russian state-owned oil company Rosneft the ability to become one of their own extraction partners in the Venezuelan oil fields, and by taking out loans from Russia, loans that they put up 49.9% of their ownership stake in Citgo in the United States as collateral for. Chavez's realignment of Venezuela towards Russia also sparked ire in Washington, which led to the Bush administration slapping a total arms embargo on Venezuela in 2006. And as oil production out of Venezuela continued dwindling under Chavez, Venezuela's oil exports to the United States continued decreasing as well. And the Gulf Coast refineries that were once absorbing millions of extra heavy crude Venezuelan barrels a day began shifting towards receiving millions of extra heavy Canadian crude oil barrels coming out of the Alberta oil sands through pipelines instead.
I think I've showed enough, right? You know, it's 48 minutes. And we're 21 minutes in. So I think I've showed enough. And it also tells enough about Guyana. So, yeah, very interesting to look at real life lore, right? So, how will the border dispute end in Venezuela? Maybe it'll be like China and India, right? So, first of all, we're going to show what it's all about, right? So we have China and India, who are basically neighbors, and they have a very, very long border, even though they both say that's not the border. You know, it's a very complex situation. But you basically have a region in India that China claims that is theirs, right? Which is this year. They claim it's theirs, even though India claims it's theirs. And you have this region here, the Sikkim region, where there's also pushback from China and India, right? And you also have this border here, which is disputed, and the Kashmir region, which is also disputed, right? Kashmir, that is very complex because you have multiple countries that say that is ours. Pakistan says Kashmir is ours. Afghanistan says Kashmir is ours. And China says, and India says Kashmir is ours. So it's a very disputed territory there. But if we look at the borders, there is someone who can better define the China-India border than I can. So I found a video of the China-India border dispute. So let's take a look at this here. It's not that long. And it's animated.
2020 was a pretty bad year, but it could have been worse. How, you ask? Well, we could have had a war between the two most populous countries in the world, China and India. This was a serious concern in June 2020 when, for the first time in almost 60 years, an incident at the disputed Chinese-Indian border turned deadly. Despite no guns being used in the fighting, about 20 Indian soldiers died, while the number of Chinese casualties remains unknown. These deaths were also the result of the treacherous terrain and harsh climate of the border region, which is defined by the Himalayas, the tallest mountain range on Earth. Almost the entirety of the border between China and India is disputed, and has been so ever since modern Chinese-Indian relations began. This yellow line, which you see on most maps, is not the official border, but what is known as the line of actual control. The line is a de facto demarcation between Chinese and Indian controlled territories. However, both sides agree that it is not the official border, since both lay claim on land which is currently controlled by the other. And as China and India increase their economic and military capabilities, there are growing concerns that the issue could escalate and lead to war, as it did once already in 1962. So, what is this border dispute about? Well, the details of this conflict are complicated, so I'll try to simplify as good as I can. The border dispute can roughly be divided into 3 major sections, all of which we are going to cover one by one. The first section lies in the very west of the border and is mostly about the disputed territory known as Aksai Chin, a virtually uninhabited, hardly accessible and desolate mountain region. China claims it's part of its Xinjiang and Tibet provinces, while India claims it belongs to its Ladakh territory, which itself is part of the larger disputed region of Kashmir. In the 19th century, the border between British-controlled India and the territory of China's Qing dynasty lay somewhere around Aksai Chin. However, due to the desolate nature of the region, it was never properly demarcated. The British, however, wanted to change this, since blurry lines make for ugly maps. In 1897, they officially proposed the Ardagh-Johnson line, which put Aksai Chin into British-controlled Kashmir. The line was initially accepted by the Chinese, however, soon after, the Qing government showed interest in the region again. To increase their influence in China, the British decided to offer the unpopulated desert to the Qing, and in 1899 they proposed the so-called McCarthy-MacDonald line as a border instead, which put Aksai Chin inside Qing territory. In response to the proposal, the Qing government did nothing. Why they didn't respond to the proposal we don't really know, and in the following century the Chinese and Indian governments would have different opinions on what that lack of a response meant. According to India, the Qing government rejected the proposal by not reacting to it, while the Chinese argue it should be interpreted as consent. Whatever the case, afterwards, official British maps would eventually favor the Ardagh-Johnson line, while Chinese maps would begin to show the McCarthy-MacDonald line after the Qing Empire had collapsed. After India gained its independence in 1947, it used a slightly modified version of the Ardagh-Johnson line, putting Aksai Chin inside Indian territory. This was vehemently opposed by the new Communist government of China, which had consolidated power by 1951 after a long Chinese civil war. The dispute over Aksai Chin escalated in 1962, and a 1-month-long war broke out in which India suffered a humiliating defeat, leaving Chinese forces in control over Aksai Chin. Since then, China has retained control over the territory. Although the region seems to have little value at first, it has strategic and economic importance. For China, controlling Aksai Chin is valuable to secure its southwestern border and to retain a strategically advantageous position against India. If India was to get hold of Aksai Chin again, it could better secure its Kashmir region while also having an improved strategic position in the western Himalayas in case of a military confrontation.
So we have that going on, right? We also have actual footage of soldiers, fighting each other, even though it's not by guns, right? Let's see if we can. You see, India deploys 10,000 more soldiers at the Indo-China border. This is why we brought it up. And also, basically, will this be reflected on what's happening in Venezuela, Guyana, right? Let's see if we can. Here we have some footage of people shoving each other. So we have that happening, right? Are we still paying attention? We're talking geopolitics, history, and stuff like that, just giving a mirror of what's really happening. Now, we haven't talked about Ukraine or Sudan yet, even though we do highlight it. We forgot Haiti, even though, it's being said, Haiti is a hellhole, right? We live on a living planet and we ignore it because we got other stuff to do, right? We got to go to work, we got to do this, we got to do that. It's really, really amazing. Stop fighting, right? Now, we're also going to show you guys the video of the president of Guyana about Venezuela, right? And let's see what the president says.
Mohammed Irfan Ali joins us tonight from Georgetown, Guyana. Mr. President, thank you so much for joining Top Story.
It's a pleasure being here. Thank you for having me.
I want to get right to it, Mr. President. Do you think Venezuela is capable and willing to invade Guyana over these oil fields?
I think Venezuela is capable of acting recklessly and acting in a manner that can destabilize the peace that exists within this region. And why I say so is directly related to the type of rhetoric, the type of narrative that is coming out of Venezuela and the action that they're taking. As you know, the ICJ, International Court of Justice, made it very clear that Venezuela could not act upon the outcome of the referendum they held a few weeks ago. Now, after that referendum, we saw Venezuela in face of this order by the ICJ, ignoring the order and moving towards announcing a series of measures that would allow them to act upon the outcome of this referendum, which includes moves towards the occupation of territory.
So the president has something to say too. You want our land, come take it. We will fight back. It's really amazing. Really, it is amazing. So that's why we highlight it, right? We don't forget. We're just repeating what we said a couple of months ago. And, will there be a war in South America, the north of South America? Who knows? Who knows? Right? What will President Trump do about this situation? They tried to assassinate, Maduro. It's also, let's see if we can find that. President Maduro. Assassination. There you go. They were using drones and such, and when this happened, he grabbed more power.
a la Venezuela consciente. Vamos a apostar por el bien de nuestro país. Ha llegado la hora de la recuperación económica y necesitamos.
Vamos por la derecha. Arriba, mi comando.
So, you could also look it up, Venezuela drone attack. I'm not making this stuff up, right? Just showing you reality. Are we paying attention? Well, I am. But are you? Let's see if we can find Ollie the Octopus. There you go. We love you, Ollie. And Charlie.
This is a scene over South London. I'm here in Fulham. It's the 10th of August, and
We will never, ever forget the London riots and the criminal who was then mayor, Boris Johnson, who was there for a photo op, right? Just give him a room and make a picture of Boris cleaning up. Right. We know you're a political snake. You should be judged for what you have done, Boris Johnson. Because of you, there's still a war raging in Ukraine.
Thank you to everybody who's come out here today to volunteer to help clear up the mess of last night. Thank you. You are the true spirit of this city.
Yeah, you're the true spirit of the country, right? Dancing over there in 10 Downing, and yeah, partying like that Finnish prime minister, right? Whilst everyone was under a lockdown.
In the streets of London, the peace has been disturbed. Fires burning everywhere, the language of the unheard. There's a generation thwarted with no ownership and pride, and fat cats with bellies as wide as the rich and poor divide. A broken social contract, bottom up austerity. Oh, we can condemn it, but we're paying attention now, aren't we? Blame it on the hoodies, blame it on the feral youth. But remember, you were young once and you cared about the truth. We sold out to the free market, made a couple of billionaires, and all we got was this mess. And McDonald's everywhere, keep unemployment high, keeps the cost of labor low, keeps young men out on the streets, and well, what do you know?
Isn't it weird? People go out to riot and stuff like that, and the next day they come back to clean up. Pretty odd.
You head down to Dixon's, you can take some stuff for free. You can get an Apple Mac and...
Hey, what's happening here? Yeah.
the high def TV, but if you work in Connecticut...
Ah, darn it. Let's start over. There you go.
Salon selected. Let Boris speak. Let Boris speak.
I just want to say thank you to everybody who's come out here today to volunteer to help clear up the mess of last night. Thank you. You are the true spirit of this city.
In the streets of London, the peace has been disturbed. Fires burning everywhere, the language of the unheard. There's a generation thwarted with no ownership and pride, and fat cats with bellies as wide as the rich and poor divide. A broken social contract, bottom up austerity. Oh, we can condemn it, but we're paying attention now, aren't we? Blame it on the hoodies, blame it on the feral youth. But remember, you were young once and you cared about the truth. We sold out to the free market, made a couple of billionaires, and all we got was this mess and McDonald's everywhere. Keep unemployment high, keeps the cost of labour low, keeps young men out on the streets, and well, what do you know? Down to Dixon's, you can take some stuff for free. You can get an Apple Mac and a high-def TV. But if you work in Canary Wharf in a bank too big to fail, there's much better looting
Oh man, not again.
going on, and you don't have to go to jail. Steal from a generation for the pockets of a few, but it can only go so far. And you're paying attention now, aren't you? Oh. In the streets of London, the peace has been disturbed. Fires burning everywhere, the language of the unheard. There's a generation thwarted with no ownership and pride, and fat cats with bellies as wide as the rich and poor divide. A broken social contract, bottom up austerity. Oh, we can condemn it, but we're paying attention now, aren't we? Blame it on the hoodies, blame it on the feral youth. But remember, you were young once and you cared about the truth. We sold out to the free market, made a couple of billionaires, and all we got was this mess and McDonald's everywhere. Keep unemployment high, keeps the cost of labour low, keeps young men out on the streets, and well, what do you know? You head down to Dixon's, you can take some stuff for free. You can get an Apple Mac and a high-def TV. But if you work in Canary Wharf in a bank too
big to fail,
big to fail, there's much better looting going on, and you don't have to go to jail. Steal from a generation for the pockets of a few, but it can only go so far, and you're paying attention now, aren't you?
always paying attention. Are we paying attention? Are we paying attention? Well, I am. I am. So, I gotta go. I'll see you guys next time.